Toronto Star. I'm Raju Mudhar, and this matters. It has been just over 2 years since the Toronto van attack that left 10 people dead and many more injured on Yonge Street. That rampage was the reason that many Canadians got a crash course in what an incel is. It's a term that is short for involuntary celibates, and now covers a movement made up of sexually frustrated men who are striking out and committing acts of violence.
It's basically a movement of angry incels, such as myself, who are unable to get laid. Therefore, we want to overthrow the Chads, which would force the Stacys to be forced to reproduce with the incels.
When you say incels?
Involuntary celibate.
In that particular case, Alec Manassian carried out the attack and is currently awaiting trial on 10 counts of first-degree murder and 16 counts of attempted murder. His trial was supposed to start in April, but has been delayed due to COVID-19. In February of this year, a 17-year-old allegedly entered a massage parlour in Toronto and attacked people there, leaving a 24-year-old woman named Ashley Noell Arzaga dead. This week, police called it an act of incel terrorism and added terrorism-related charges to that case, which experts say was a legal first and a significant moment in terms of our national security.
And so today, the charges against the 17-year-old male suspect in the February stabbing at a Toronto massage parlor were upgraded. The first time an alleged incel-inspired killing has been formally labeled as terrorism by police.
And then, in its annual report to Parliament, CSIS, Canada's top spy agency, announced that it is changing how it looks at terrorism, and in particular, reclassifying it in terms of the motives behind it. It also specifically mentioned incels as a threat that they are concerned about. All this does signal a change in how authorities are at least perceiving this threat. To discuss what this all means, we are joined by Alex Boutilier. He is a national politics reporter with the Toronto Star who covers national security. Alex, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
So the news here that we want to discuss is about Canada's top spy agency, CSIS, deciding to look at terrorists in a new way. Can you explain what the news is here?
So yesterday, CSIS released its annual report, and they focus on domestic threats to Canada. And they basically said that they want to redefine how they discuss violent extremism in Canada. So post 9/11, much of the intelligence community has been focused on Islamist-inspired terrorism from groups like Al-Qaeda or Daesh, trying to inspire people in other countries like Canada to carry out attacks on Canadian soil. The report makes clear that those groups are still a threat, and they really have written the playbook on how to inspire people online and to spread propaganda. But the report says that no one group has a monopoly on this threat. So what CSIS tried to do in their annual report yesterday is redefine how they think about and talk about violent extremism. They're trying to categorize it into sort of three different groups focused on motivation. So religious, ideological, and political. I think everybody's pretty familiar with religious extremism, groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Political extremism, while we haven't seen a lot of examples of that in Canada in recent years, I think it's kind of self-evident what that would mean. The really interesting bit is ideological extremism. So that encompasses a whole range of groups and grievances and the motivations that lead people to embark on a violent extremist attack. So we're familiar with, in Canada, right-wing extremism. It's something that we've been talking a lot more about in recent years since the 2017 shooting at the Quebec Mosque. But the motivations for what we call right-wing extremism are pretty disparate, right? So in the case of the 2017 shooting in Quebec, it was motivated by a fear or hatred or concern about immigration, specifically Muslim immigration. The 2014 shooting in Moncton, which killed 3 RCMP officers, was motivated by anti-authority beliefs. Those are two very different sort of things that we sort of talked about as right-wing extremism. So what CSIS, I think, is trying to do here is say, look, all of these are extremist violence. All of these are extremist attacks. But to really be specific and to think about, what's behind them, we have to look at the individual motivations. And that includes groups like incels, involuntary celibates, who are frustrated and angry about their inability to attract a sexual partner and have turned to kind of this nihilistic online movement, which, as we've seen in recent years, can lead to extremist violence or inspire extremist violence.
I want to talk specifically about incels in a second, but I wanted just to go back about sort of the motivations of this. Is part of this trying to just sort of separate that glut of right-wing extremism or the catch-all of just sort of alt-right and trying to differentiate between these different types of groups?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's to be specific about language. Look, we're reporters. We know that words matter. And when you lump disparate motivations into one group and call it right-wing extremism, that's, first of all, inaccurate, according to CSIS, but second of all, leads to all kinds of political considerations. So I did a series for The Star a few years back about right-wing extremism. My colleagues at Vice have done a lot of work on right-wing extremism. And one of the top comments that I get whenever I write about right-wing extremism is, well, what about left-wing extremism? First of all, left-wing extremism really hasn't been a huge issue in Canada. But, when you use broad categories like this, you can get into trouble. You can obscure some of the actual motivations behind a crime and shut the conversation down pretty quickly if people think you're talking politics rather than national security. So I think what CSIS is trying to do here is be a little bit more specific in their language because words matter.
It's been 2 years since the van attack in Toronto in 2018. I think that's when most Canadians got a crash course in exactly what incels are all about. Do you think that this reclassifying or clarifications was motivated by that attack?
I think it probably played a part. Look, if you go through CSIS reports dating back to the year 2000, and I have for all my sins, when they talk about extremism, they were really talking about jihadist extremism, people inspired by groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda, among others. You've seen in recent CSIS reports over the last couple of years more talk about other sorts of extremist attacks that both the media in North America and I think the political class in North America have really been slow to identify as extremists. Recall a few years back, I think 2014, there was a group of teens who planned to shoot up a mall in Halifax. And the Justice Minister at the time, Peter MacKay, said that these people were not terrorists, they were murderous misfits or something along those lines. Well, if you plan a mass killing at a soft target like a shopping mall, how is that different from somebody doing the same in Kabul? So I think you've seen a growing awareness among Canada's national security agencies in recent years that the motivations and the sources of these types of extremist attacks is a lot more varied than perhaps common thinking has held it for the last couple of decades.
It's really interesting, the timing of this, that it happens this week when incel motives are in the news again because of a February massage parlor attack in Toronto where a 17-year-old was charged, and now they've added terrorism charges to it. Are these things related in any way?
So the thing about government reports is they take a very long time and a lot of people to put together. So I wouldn't say that they're directly related, but I think that it is interesting that this report drops a day after the RCMP and Toronto police added those terrorism charges to that attack in North York. Those charges are notable for a couple of reasons. It's the first time somebody's been charged with terrorism federally in Canada that doesn't have to do with Al-Qaeda or Daesh-inspired terrorism, so that's noteworthy in itself. The other reason I think it's interesting is because talking to national security lawyers and people sort of involved in the counterterrorism world, oftentimes when you have an attack like this, you want to charge them with murder because murder is much easier to prove than their connection to a terrorist movement. So if you can get somebody for first-degree murder or attempted murder, that's probably enough from a cost-benefit analysis in a legal sense. So the fact that police felt comfortable bringing terrorism charges, especially novel terrorism charges against incel ideology-motivated attacks, tells me that they probably have pretty firm footing in terms of what they found on this person's motivation. We don't know that evidence yet. That hasn't been released. But I think that based on conversations I've had over the years with national security folks, I would think that the police would have to be pretty confident they had a good case for a terrorist-motivated attack.
We've already seen some ugly incidences, either from this report or talking to those national security experts. How much are incels in particular a threat?
In reporting the story that I wrote on Wednesday, talking to national security folks, they want to be very clear that incels are not a terrorist threat to the country. People who commit violence after being inspired or radicalized by incel ideology are. right? Just in the same way that Islam is not a threat to the country, but those who are radicalized to extremist religious violence, they are a threat. So it's not to say that Canadian Security Intelligence Service is now going to be monitoring every corner of Reddit to keep tabs on anybody who might identify or ascribe to incel ideology. It's to say that they recognize that incel ideology can radicalize people to violent extremist acts. And I think that in and of itself is an important point, especially, given the sort of tone of the conversation around violent extremism since 2001.
One of the things about incels is that they are often radicalized by being online.
The issue is now, rather than seeking help among the people around you, now you can go online, you can go to people who have developed the community based on that grievance, and you can basically get sucked in. In a lot of cases with actual terrorist attacks, we see that the radicalization process happens very quickly, sometimes as little as weeks or months.
And due to this pandemic, we are all currently more online than we ever have been. Does this report say anything about how to solve the incel problem? I know deplatforming is something that has been tried.
Yeah, I think it's interesting your point about being online all the time now. And one of the common sort of threads you hear in a lot of stories about people who are radicalized is how much of a community that they find among those looking to radicalize them or who share radical beliefs. So I think that, that's something that I'm sure the national security agencies are very alive to, but it's a difficult problem to solve. In terms of proposed solutions to this, the report doesn't talk about what CSIS is going to do operationally to address this threat. The fact that it made it into the report itself suggests to me that there is some operational stuff going on, or at least that they're aware of the threat from an operational standpoint. But deplatforming is certainly one tool, although a controversial one. If people are going to seek out this sort of community, seek out this sort of information, it's very easy to do. It's not like it's very hidden. At the same time, there has been some research done into providing alternative messages to people who are seeking out extremist content. So if you look for a video about whatever ideological extremism is your flavor, platforms like Google, Facebook, others, identifying that and providing a fact check or providing options for people to seek out help or, mental health treatment or what have you, in order to put that sort of good information and that helpful information alongside the information that people are going to find. There's a company called Moonshot CBE who does a lot of work in this area, who is working with the Canadian government right now around so-called right-wing extremism to provide those sort of counter-messaging strategies to show people that what they're watching is not the only truth out there. There are different perspectives and there are at times, misleading information. So that sort of strategy, I think, is one way that people are trying to counter the proliferation of extremist groups online.
You may have already answered this, but I did want to ask this. And you wrote it, that this doesn't necessarily change anything that CSIS does operationally. But my question is, doesn't it have to?
It's a good question. A lot of these attacks are so-called lone wolf attacks. That's kind of a misleading term because nobody completely on their own wakes up, ascribes to an ideology and carries out a violent extremist attack. But when people are operating by themselves and being radicalized online, that's a very, very difficult thing for intelligence agencies and law enforcement to keep tabs on. And if law enforcement and intelligence agency tried to, I think we might be a little bit uncomfortable about CSIS monitoring, like I said, every corner of Reddit or every online forum in the name of trying to prevent these attacks. At the same time, I think the fact that, again, they reference specifically incel-motivated attacks in this report is a sign that CSIS is taking it seriously. At the same time, CSIS discontinued sort of a rolling investigation into right-wing extremism a year before the shooting at the Quebec City Mosque. So it hadn't been a priority for the agency until that event. But I get the sense from their public statements and from people I talk to on the inside that it is now a renewed focus for the agency, and they're at least aware of the threat. There's no way to completely prevent so-called lone wolf attacks, but certainly intelligence and law enforcement taking the issue seriously is the first step.
So is this really much more of a mindset thing for the agency and I guess for national security experts? more broadly?
Well, I don't think it just stops there. I think it's a mindset thing for all of us, right? Most people who radicalize to violence, I think half of people who radicalize to violence show some signs that they're on that trajectory. Somebody knows something about a lot of folks who end up going down a violent path. So I think that we all have to sort of be aware in our lives to watch out for people who are in trouble and to think about violent extremism differently than we may have thought of it in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and subsequent war on terror in the United States. So yeah, I think part of it is a mindset thing. In terms of the national security agencies, it's also a resource thing. There are a number of very serious threats to Canada and the national security position. And these agencies have limited budgets and limited attention spans. And if you're not paying attention to the threat, then you're not going to detect it and you're not going to be able to, hopefully prevent it. So I think what we've seen from CSIS specifically and from the national security community in Canada more generally is a wider awareness of potential threats to Canada and communicating that directly to Canadians. And I think that, like I said, that's a first step. Unfortunately, we don't have much visibility on what that means operationally for them.
Let's pull the focus back a little bit. Who else does this new reclassification target or cover? Is it all sort of just extreme far-right thing? Are we talking about like homesteaders who decide they want to take their land back? That sort of thing. Is that covered already or?
Yeah, so that again would fall into what we normally in the media call right-wing extremism, survivalists, free men on the land, natural law adherents who think that everything stems from the Magna Carta and Canadian laws have no sway over them. That's certainly covered in the ideological extremist category from CSIS. Ethno-nationalists, neo-Nazis, again, groups that we would typically call right-wing extremists would fall into that ideological category. So would groups motivated by the environment, motivated violence by the risk of climate change. That also would fall into the ideological category. So it's much more broad than what we've been calling right-wing extremism. It's more anybody who commits a violent act because of an ideology or because of deeply held beliefs that radicalize them to take that step.
So basically the acknowledgement here is that whatever your motive, you can be a terrorist now under Canadian law.
Yeah, I mean, nothing has changed legally. You could make the case that that has always been the case, that terrorism charges, while they've historically been brought against jihadist terrorists, applied to a lot of these attacks and maybe should have been applied to some of these attacks. But it's a tricky thing. Terrorism charges are much harder to prove than murder charges. So if you've got a situation like the 2017 Quebec City mosque shooting, it's easier to put that perpetrator behind bars for life on multiple murder charges than it is to prove that he was motivated and radicalized by far-right voices online, although certainly we saw plenty of evidence of that in the trial. So I think what CSIS is saying here is that we have to be precise when we talk about types of extremism, and that extremist violence is not the sole tool of any one ideology. It spans the spectrum. Now, we may have more evidence of neo-Nazi hate crimes or violence than eco-terrorist violence in Canada. But nevertheless, if we just lump everything into right-wing or left-wing extremism, we might be missing the point.
Alex, this has been fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that we should know?
It's a very interesting development. It'll be interesting to see how widely it's adopted within how the Canadian government talks about these sort of things, and whether or not changing the terminology means changing the priority of our national security agencies. Thanks
very much for being with us today.
A pleasure. Thank you.
That was Alex Boutilier, who is a national politics reporter with the Toronto Star in our Ottawa bureau. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.